This week's episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 9th of February 2022 at home in Wicklow. And the topic of today's episode is defiance, and the idea of defiance as a key tool of wellness, of self-care, of personal responsibility, of personal autonomy. I also talk about certitude that to be fully effective and to serve you best must resist the temptation of rigidity and absolutism. Certitude is only of use if it retains a certain mobility and flexibility that allows it to take some tough times, that allows it to absorb the pressure of adverse effects. So that is largely what I'm talking about today. Defiance as something that can be incorporated into your lo-fi, gentle hum wellness. It doesn't have to be a big political public demonstration, but if you listen, you'll find out in all the ways I explore it how it can be useful to you. Okay, so that's what's coming up. I hope you can find time to listen. I'll see you there. Cheers. Bye.
Not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. Welcome. That was one of those emphatic highs, wasn't it? Hi, Dara Clear here, bringing you this report from Wicklow. There you go now. So, happy this day, whichever day this is. You're listening to this little broadcast. I hope you're well. I hope you're in a good space. Personally, I'm going to struggle today with this. It's going to be an uphill push. It's going to be a Sisyphusian act of defiance, and defiance is going to be very much in the mix today. I say this because I'm not in a very forward-facing frame of mind, and if you are keeping yourself relatively up to speed with business lingo, business terminology, forward-facing describes any aspect of a business that is in direct contact with customers and clients. So forward-facing, not the backroom staff, not the admin team behind that closed door, but your receptionists, if you will, your sales assistants, if you will, your meet and greet peeps. That's forward-facing. And the podcast, this podcast is, of course, a forward-facing effort, despite the factual setup of me being alone in a room with a microphone. It is a forward-facing conceit. This little charade of one voice, one microphone, and an imagined audience. It is the walk. It's the walk of the tightrope, and I just don't know where the tightrope leads, and I don't know if there's anybody watching spellbound in the circus seats beneath me as they, open-mouthed, eyes agog, mindlessly feed themselves popcorn or candy floss or peanuts, and they wait for the red-haired fool to fall off the tightrope and break his bloomin' neck. That's theatre, actually, isn't it? That's the high wire act of live performance That's the agreement to lock yourself in a dark room with someone else to wait and see what's going to happen. The consumption of cinema is a little bit like that as well. I referred to that last week when speaking about the voyeuristic frame, the voyeuristic perspective of how we think about cinema, consuming those images. That refers to the English film critic David Thompson's prevailing idea around cinema. We watch in the dark, the safety of being hidden. Actually, speaking of last week's episode, when last week's episode was very much centered around female love on screen, and particularly same-sex female love, so lesbian affairs, and I was citing a few different movies. I did focus particularly on Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire. And after I'd finished recording, I realised there'd been a couple of notable omissions. And one of the reasons for a couple of those omissions, in terms of the movies I was talking about, is quite simply, even though I'm aware of them, I've never watched them. One is the recent movie Ammonite with Kate Winslet and Saoirse Ronan, which I haven't watched yet, but was critically very well received. And again, a superficially similar setup to Portrait of a Lady on Fire in terms of being a period drama, in terms of one woman dealing with a certain amount of repression, maybe from a slightly more mainstream layer of society, level of society, and a archaeologist. I think Kate Winslet is someone who studies fossils. I mean, that's where you get the Ammonite of the title, but they fall in love, and it's based on a true story. And again, there's that whole thing of appropriation of female discovery by men, in terms of that Kate Winslet character's findings being, I think, claimed by men. Anyway, that was an omission. Also, The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant, the Werner Fassbinder movie from, I want to say 1971. I'm not sure if that's correct. Again, a movie I only know by reputation and reading sort of contemporaneous reviews, one I've never seen. And that involved 3 female characters in, quite a trippy looking movie if you go back and look at the trailer. But then very much the sort of paraphernalia and iconography, color scheme of the time, one I will watch at some point. And then a third movie that I have seen but didn't mention, my cousin here at #blessed referred to it, is The Hunger. Again, a sort of an early or mid-80s modern vampire movie, like vampires living in contemporary New York, and David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve are the vampires, and they bring Susan Sarandon into their little relationship. So there is, I mean, it's not, I don't know how central it is, but there is definitely a sex scene or a love scene or a vampiric love scene in any case between Deneuve and Sarandon. An early Tony Scott movie, already showing the sort of hallmarks of his style. Very, such an 80s movie. Shoulder pads. Shoulder pads, that's my memory. Shoulder pads and soft lighting and shadow. So sort of strangely noirish for quite a well-lit movie. Anyway, maybe those 3 movies should have been mentioned last week. So there you go. Just thought I'd drag them out of the ether just as a little throwback to last week's episode. In any case, moving on, I sat down here to record, and I found myself looking at a book my wife has borrowed from the library, and it's a very pretty little hardback book, published in 2016, and it's in excellent condition. So maybe it hasn't been borrowed very much, and it is called The Little Book of, and I'm going to spell this word for you, Hygge. The Little Book of Hygge. And the subtitle is The Danish Way to Live Well. And the author is Make Viking. Today we are going to make Vikings together. First, grab a Scandinavian man or woman. Viking is the surname. Now, I don't know if the Danes pronounce their W's like V's, because then it would be Make Viking, which would be quite cool in a way. Anyway, fundamentally, this book is, I'm holding it in my hand. It's smaller than A2. It's really a little thing. So it's a small coffee table book, and fundamentally, my understanding of it after a browse is it's like a Danish equivalent of Feng Shui. And as I flick through the book, all the photographs, it's got this nice kind of matte finish, and I can't shake the feeling that it's this sort of, a philosophy of aesthetics that tries to get you to make your abode, your living spaces, and your shared experiences look like an Apple photo shoot. So my apologies if that's offensive to devotees of Hygge. And just to give you a brief intro to this. In fact, the first the first few lines of the introduction, they offer up 3 different pronunciations of this word: Hygge, Hygge, Hygge. It's not important how you choose to pronounce or even spell Hygge. To paraphrase one of the greatest philosophers of our time, Winnie the Pooh, when asked how to spell a certain emotion, you don't spell it, you feel it. So the book basically lost me there. Just don't give me that sitting on the fence crap. Tell me how to pronounce the word, and don't wishy-washy it in an infantilized reference to Winnie the Pooh. Now, I know, I'm aware of Benjamin Hoff's work and The Tao of Pooh and The Tale of Piglet, and it has its place. Those books have their place, and as a younger man, I did enjoy The Tao of Pooh. And sometimes these books are nice little pop cultural artifacts, and they're nice little entry points to deeper thinking and to a deeper engagement with philosophy or spirituality. And there's no reason to judge that stuff. That's nice, isn't it? Let's make it accessible. Let's make it cute. I'm not a big fan of cute, though. Cute kind of, to borrow an Australian term, cute gives me the shits. That's not to be taken literally. Thanks very much. But yeah, The Little Book of Hygge. It's a cute thing. It's a nice little pretty thing, and it seems to revolve largely around nice lamps and nice candles and not having too many people to share the moment, because then you lose the vibe. You lose that kind of organic intimacy. So it's, there's a little bit of a fascist streak in there of control and exclusion, and this is the way to do it. So yeah, there you go. Thanks Mike Viking. Let's Mike some Vikings today. Now, of what relevance is The Little Book of Hygge to my topic today? Well, if the linchpin of today's discussion is going to revolve around defiance, we could start with The Little Book of Hygge and present that as a little case study of this is the way to do it. Here is the received model. Here is the received wisdom. Here is a code of aesthetics, that are going to lead to greater social cohesion, perhaps, greater happiness, and again, to refer to the subtitle, a greater ability to live well following the Danish model. Of course, you can just introduce an act of defiance and go, no, it doesn't feel very organic if it's all orchestrated. So I find there's a little part of me that just resists that resists the manipulation of, isn't this so perfect? And I don't know what that makes me, a Philistine of some kind, perhaps, because I know people. I can make things happen. I can make it disappear like that. I know people who value this kind of thing really highly. In fact, I think even amongst my listeners, I know people like that who treasure the aesthetic, who integrate the aesthetic into their worldview and cherish beautiful things and beautiful items and the vibes that attain to such items, and bringing people into a space with, into a space of aesthetic thoughtfulness, aesthetic consideration, aesthetic value, of course, can enhance the experience, can enhance the event, the occasion. And I guess, I what sort of moron would I be not to recognize that that's a valuable thing? I'd be maybe a little bit of a uptight moron. I'd be a bit of an overthinking moron, I guess, if that's not an oxymoron. He's a very smart moron. That's an oxymoron right there, isn't it? So, defiance. You don't have to accept anything, do you? Really? I mean, that is in one's prerogative. And my argument fundamentally is that to have the capacity for defiance in your arsenal is a really powerful aspect of your own wellness. I believe that very strongly. I believe in the capacity to assert your own values, to assert your own worldview, to assert your personality and your personhood, your identity, your agency in the world, in spite of your choice perhaps moving in a very different direction to the choices of others. Now, you have to qualify that. So I was about to say, within reason, because if nothing else, I'm a reasonable man, and I don't think anyone should have a problem with that, because I expect some reciprocal reasonability. I expect some reciprocal even-handedness, and I don't think that's a bad aspiration, or a bad hope, or a bad desire for the world, particularly in the current moment, where it seems, and I have touched on this in recent episodes, where it seems at the moment in the world that the nature of so much discourse is incredibly attritional and accusatory and volatile and hypersensitive and hyper-personalized, and it just seems to completely disregard the possibility of a true exchange. It seems to, and disregard isn't the word I'm looking for, what is that word? It doesn't allow for the openness or the opening of the scope of the conversation. Things get reduced and narrowed almost immediately to, this is my perspective and that's the only thing that counts. And that may sound like it contradicts this sort of philosophy of defiance that I'm going to advocate today, but it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, quite the contrary. My fundamental argument is that your own, and I'm hesitating to use this word because sometimes it can make your, sometimes I associate it with kind of rigidity of thought or feeling, but your own certitude. But again, we can qualify that word. I was going to say your own certitude in your value system, your own certitude in your alignment with the world, your alignment with yourself and how you position yourself in the world. That certitude can be an ever evolving thing. That certitude can be enormously flexible. And it's my belief that certitude is only of value if it doesn't become dogma, if it doesn't become a weapon with which to beat other people, if it doesn't become a weapon on which to impale your enemies. Your certitude is, in my opinion, best deployed when it represents the information you currently have, or the information you've acquired over your lifetime, and the conclusion it's brought you to today. But the risk is then to go, the risk is to shut up shop. The risk then is to pack away your reflection. The risk is then to pack away your critical thinking. The risk is then to consider yourself done, completed, arrived, with no more discovery available. Is that not the most depressing position in the world? To convince yourself that there's nothing more to learn, that there's no room, there's no room for anything else. I mean, this is the sort of the humility metaphor. So if your sense of accomplishment or your sense of wisdom, your sense of certitude is represented by the metaphor of a cup that is full. The question is, well, what else can you put in the cup? If it's full, there's nothing else. And this is why for some people, the receipt of new information, the acquisition of new information, or the imposition of new information can cause that cup to overflow. And if that's where my aesthetic impulse kicks in, because I don't like an overflowing cup. It bothers me. It stresses me out. If I bring up an image in my mind of a nice little saucer and a lovely cup sitting in that saucer, and then my beverage of choice being poured into that cup, I don't want it to come all the way to the brim. I want it to sit about 5 millimeters, below the rim and not overflow. And I want it to sit there and be something that satisfies me aesthetically. Now that said, if you're if you're to look at my twice a day latte, I have a nice sort of chocolate brown coffee cup. That's my coffee cup. That's where I make my coffee twice a day. And by the time I add my froth, that froth sits about 5 mil above the rim. But of course, if the blend of the coffee and the froth has gone as I've hoped, it just sits there perfectly and is in no danger of spilling. But typically, I sit that cup on on the bench, on the counter in the kitchen, and I do not lift it to take the first drink. I descend. I descend as if I'm bowing before a king or queen, and I descend and bring my mouth to the cup. Mouth to cup, not cup to mouth. So that's an egregious breach of etiquette, and I'd be kicked out of any establishment for doing that if such things mattered. But anyway, the idea then is to allow your cup, so to speak, to allow your cup be emptied. So then the question is, if we're keeping track with the metaphor, so if this metaphor of the cup holds your sense of knowledge, your sense of understanding, what else could go in there? Your sense of sort of spiritual wellness. I'll use that word again, your sense of alignment and harmony with the world in which you find yourself. I think it's dangerous if you turn the key on that, if you lock it there, because that then is something that, in my opinion, is rigid and unwieldy, and that is not conducive to sustained wellness. I believe we have to embrace a certain flexibility that goes along with our rigor, that goes along with our conscientious self-care, that goes along with the implementation of wellness staples in our lives. I believe there has to be a flexibility there. So let's jump from one metaphor to another. A tree. A big, strong, beautiful tree. Roots going deep into the earth from which it gets its nutrition. Branches reaching high into the sky. Leaves making food for the tree in the form of chlorophyll. The tree also giving life all around by the production of oxygen, the absorption of carbon dioxide, this wonderfully sustainable organism. And it is strong, it is upright, it is life-giving, it is a part of nature, it connects to the earth and to the sky. And yet, it is flexible. And we can look out in the garden or walk through a park or walk through a city and see these impressive trees that we love so well. And they can feel like permanent fixtures. And they are points of reference for us all. And yet, they are flexible. They move so as not to fall. They move so as not to snap. And I think that's a good one. I think that last thought is a nice one to bring into your sense of how do I carry myself in the world? How do I carry this knowledge and wisdom that I've acquired so far? How do I carry the experiences that have shaped and formed me? Well, carry them with fortitude, carry them with strength, carry them with self-possession, but don't carry them so intently that they can't accommodate any resistance whatsoever. Now, let's bring it back. Let's bring it all back to defiance. So, I'm going to jump around this as usual, as is my wont. And I'm going to start with my daughter. Now, last night, my daughter came into the the main sort of living area where we spend most of our time at #blessed. She had a little towel wrapped around her. She'd come out of the shower, and she her own little rituals and routines involve her being very sort of drifty-wifty and, just following, where her immediate interest takes her. And this is never more evident to me than when she comes out of the shower. So her coming out of the shower, to me, it's like, okay, dry yourself quickly, get your pajamas on, and get ready for either bed or dinner or whatever, the next thing that is happening. And I'm often kind of barking at her to, come on, quick, hurry up, dry yourself, stop farting around. But last night she came into the living area, and her eye was caught by a breakfast cereal box, an empty breakfast cereal box that had been chucked into like a fuel box beside the stove. The stove, which was, fully lit and burning away, and therefore very hot. And she sees it, and she was immediately like disgusted. Who put this here? And I was very relieved to know that I had not been the person who had put it there. And my wife had no memory of putting it there, but she was most certainly the only person who could have done it, because my daughter and I had already had a little moment around the cereal box earlier in the morning before she went to school, because she'd taken the box over to her table where she has all her bits and pieces and where she's meant to do her homework, and she has her assigned space, and it's permanently cluttered and covered in stuff, and it's the absolute opposite of the little book of so right there's my daughter's act of defiance in the face of and anyway, I was like, what are you doing with that cereal box? That's for the stove, let's burn it. And she said, no, I'm going to paint it. I'm like, okay. But at some point my wife had seen it there, folded it up and put it beside the stove for burning. So after the shower, there's my daughter, with a tiny towel wrapped around her, otherwise completely naked, and just makes a beeline to get that box. And I'm looking at the stove, blazing hot, and I don't think I shouted at her, but I was like, stop, don't get it, don't touch it. And she just ploughed ahead. Ploughed ahead as if my voice, as if I'd been suddenly rendered completely mute, and as if there was nothing else in the world except her and a path to that box. And there she was, leaning over the other fuel containers with logs and briquettes, and reached over right beside the stove, half naked, and grabbed what she wanted. And so I reprimanded her. I said, I cannot stand it when you do that. I just told you not to do that. It's because I don't want you going near the stove when you're blooming naked. And thankfully my wife supported me. And my daughter's just looking at me kind of like, you're a fool, because this is important to me and I need this thing, and I'm disgusted that somebody put it there beside the stove where I didn't want it to be. And I sort of recognized that. I recognized her journey. I knew exactly what her processes were. After, as part of like the latter part of me giving out to her, I said, listen, you're being so bloody headstrong. And I said, first I said, you're so stubborn. And she kind of made a little face at that. And I said, you're so headstrong. And she said, what does headstrong mean? I said, it means stubborn. Because I just can't say anything just once, as anyone who listens to this podcast would know. But I said, listen, that's actually can be a really, really good, that can be a really good quality. That can be something that's very useful. And I think it means you're probably not going to be pushed around, which I really like. But when it's me or your mother speaking, there's no place for it. So yeah, so but so anyway, to keep it on track with this idea then of what then does defiance mean? Defiance it's a great act of agency, and it's a great act of personal assertion. And of course, it's particularly sort of sharply delineated when that act of defiance is in direct opposition to authority. So let's argue for a second that I am in a position of authority, as fanciful as that notion is. Let's argue that I'm in a position of authority in this household, in this family. My daughter is frequently displaying, fierily displaying her defiant impulses, and it is challenging at times, but there's a part of me that absolutely loves it and cherishes it and hopes it's something that stays very much intact. It's the Chinese person standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square. It may also be, arguably the peaceful protester in Czechoslovakia sticking the flower into the barrel of the soldier's gun. So defiance. Of course, defiance can be a form of protest. It's the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire. That was in Vietnam, wasn't it? These are acts of defiance, public acts of defiance in the most extreme and frightening situations. But we recognize them. We recognize them as displays of tremendous personal conviction. And when that plays out in the face of authority, and particularly in the face of totalitarian regimes, particularly in the face of the threat of violence or the threat of death, they're all the more impressive. And in a way, I suppose when we think in those terms, we probably find it easier to appreciate or easier to understand, or when we place it into the context of social or political or peaceful protest. And you think of the great sort of advocates of peaceful defiance, particularly probably Gandhi and Martin Luther King, amongst others. The act of protest, when informed by philosophical or spiritual or political or social principles, is very inspiring. It's very resonant, and it speaks to us of tremendous personal integrity. And that's something I'm never not interested in. And I think that there's a model there that we can take back into our personal experience and our personal engagement with wellness, our personal engagement with psychological and emotional and physical self-care. And see, I would argue that there's a pressure. There's a pressure that many of us experience, a pressure to fall into a model of behavior in society, and a pressure to conform with what's been laid out for us. And social media and the sort of the big tech machine of data gathering is like it's a huge sort of social engineering, complex. Like you talk about, like the industrial military complex. Like what we have now is a sort of a big tech industrial complex, and a big sort of social media, online industrial complex that has access to a sort of incomprehensible amount of information about the citizens of the world and how we live our lives in an online space. And there's I think, well, and I'm not great at this, but I know there's people who are massively concerned about how that data is used, and clearly we're at a point in the evolution of technology and of the online space and of the technologies that exist there. We're reaching a point where governments and the general sort of level of concern has risen to a point where serious questions are being asked of companies like Facebook and companies like Google, and how they wield their power, in this online world, which is it's like a lawless state. And in a way, of course, there's been a sort of a waiting game of where is this all going, where is it taking us, and the speed of the technical evolution is something that I think regulation hasn't been able to keep up with. But there's no question that world has changed in very profound ways how we live. It's changed how companies run. It's changed how people earn money, and it's like this monstrously sort of deregulated space, or unregulated space. So it would have had to have been regulated in the first place to be deregulated. So like an unregulated space. But it's almost impossible not to be connected in some way to it, and not to be dependent on it in some way also. So my question is, how within that world, and in the way that world is used to endlessly present us, models of living and models of behavior, and I would argue models of, consumption, and models of lifestyle curation, models of lifestyle presentation. Within all of that, how do we enact our own sort of our own philosophy of defiance? And really, I suppose for me the natural follow-on question is, you need to know what you're defying. Like, that surely is a central idea to defiance. What are you actually resisting? What do you choose to resist? What do you choose to stand up to? What do you choose to reject? And then the personal aspect of that is, how do you choose to act out that defiance? How do you choose to live that? And in a way, there's a huge part of me which is ironic, of course, considering I've made a choice to produce this podcast as an extension of the writing that I've done on the clearout.com for 9 years now. Putting stuff out into the public space. Ironically, even though I do that, there's a part of me that would advocate turning away from that space. There's a part of me that would advocate shutting all of that down and living invisibly and living anonymously and not living in the public space, which again is, that's a contradiction that comes face to face with my acting background, my performance background, my teaching background, where I've been, of course, in front of people, where that's how I've made a living, where I've made money, and in different settings where I've, advocated a lot of the stuff I talk about on the podcast in terms of personal philosophy, personal responsibility, self-care, personal autonomy, personal agency. I mean, all of those ideas are fundamental to how I think about wellness and how I think about self-care. On that idea then of presentation, and on that idea of personal autonomy, I was thinking around the idea of ownership and authorship. So, and this in my opinion connects to personal wellness oriented defiance. So, ownership, this idea of self-possession, the idea of I own myself, I do not belong to anybody else. I am my own person. I can think for myself. I can form my own opinions. I can act and build my world in a way that connects to my value system, connects to my outlook, is integral to how I'm choosing to live my life. And the authorship then is I have the right to be the author of my own story. I have the right to create my own narrative. And I'm saying, me, my, mine, my own. I mean this as this is a template that we can all use. And it's one that I believe, it's one that I've advocated as a teacher of young people for over 20 years now, really. Your right to own your own feelings, to own your own thoughts, to own your own narrative. That is then, another way of saying that is that you are your own text. So last week and in other episodes, I've spoken about female texts in specific contexts. But let's take this in a general sense then. You are your own text. You write your own story. You assert agency over your own narrative, your own life, your own history. And through that, you define your understanding of yourself. Now, that's fine. That's fine. But what happens when you put yourself out into the world? What happens when you make yourself available to others? What happens when you leave your private space and go out into the world, into the public space? What happens when you enter a workplace? What happens when you enter a community? What happens when you walk down the street? What happens when you are part of the everyday human animal experience? Do you continue to belong to yourself? So last week I was listening to Blind Boy's latest podcast, and he was talking about semiotics, the study and interpretation of signs and symbols, and he referred to Roland Barthes, the famous French writer, critic and semiotician, and he referred to a key Barthes text, which I feel I studied in college. I love the vagueness. I'm pretty sure that was mentioned at one point in some English lecture. We definitely did, deconstructivism, Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault. These guys who were breaking down how we thought about texts. And anyway, Blind Boy referred to a key Barthes text, The Death of the Author. And the central tenet of that essay is that once the text is completed, the author surrenders meaning. That meaning is apportioned to the text by the consumer. It's apportioned to the text by the reader. So the author might have their own sort of drive, their own drivers behind the story, their own motivations, their own interpretations. But once that text is out there, it's gone, and now it's just an artifact for other people to build their own association with, to project their own meaning onto. And in that way, the art form, the text, is in a permanent state of flux of meaning and availability of meaning and an openness to interpretation. And so, anything, any artwork is susceptible to this. Any artwork can be understood in this way. And again, you can stay with the generic term text. So any artwork then is a text to be read, to be looked at, to be taken in visually, and then let it do its work on your consciousness, your brain, your emotional state, your history. My argument is, can we not apply that same idea to ourselves? If we're the text and we go out there into the world, then we are no longer immune. We are no longer separated from or sealed off from in a hermetic way. We're no longer set aside from the interpretation of the world and from the meaning of the world that is projected onto us. Now, one way to preserve that state is to never leave the house. To the attempt to remain completely anonymous. Now, we are not living in anonymous times. People have never shared more of themselves online. They've never lived more of their lives online. And I mean, I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. And it's, really what I do online, the online space, what I present here on the podcast, or what I have written on the website, on the blog, they're all expressions of the things I'm interested in, and they serve their own purpose in terms of what they do for me. And then beyond that, really what I'm trying to do is, well, if there's a means to raise my profile, if there's a means to build an audience, and if there's a means to make money in some way, directly or indirectly, as a result of the creative output, then that to me is very desirable, because it's a way of avoiding doing other things that are less pleasurable. And that's why I put myself out there. And yet I recognize the value of anonymity. And the fact that I'm just sitting here in my room recording this, this is completely artificial. So I speak as if I'm speaking to you directly, particularly because to date, the podcast, with the exception of the Christmas special, when my wife and my cousin and myself, did a bit of singing, it's a monologue. It's a monologue-based podcast. It's press record and think, speak, feel in a stream, built around 2 or 3, hopefully connected and understandable ideas, with the broader objective of advocating positive psychology, wellness, personal responsibility, etc. But come back then to the idea of what are we sacrificing in a way when we step out into the world? I mean, I suppose you could argue there's safety. There's, how autonomous do you continue to be once you're out, being affected by and impacted by anyone you come into contact with. And what of the self do you sacrifice by making yourself visible? And that recalls some of the ideas I spoke about last week, which was very much about being seen and the power of seeing. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about, it's conceptual, and it's tied up in what I think is important, which is one's personal philosophy, one's personal credo, the arrangement of one's ideas and convictions and values, and how they then inform how one chooses to act, how one chooses to be. And insofar as they are concepts that dwell inside one's mind, they can't be touched by the outside world. And therein lies their strength. But therein lies what? There's a sort of a surreal nature to that when you start to look at it and kind of go, well, okay, well, what's the concrete aspect of a thought? Now that just makes my head explode. Because I'm building a world around something completely abstract, a concept, an idea, a philosophy, a sort of an arrangement, a constellation of ideas, a conspiracy of ideas, a cooperation, a conflagration of ideas. And what bearing does that have on anything other than my own state of mind, my own state of being? Now, it's up to you. It's up to you to decide. Does that inform your sense of strength? Does that inform your sense of agency? I believe it does. I believe it can be hugely informative of the choices you make, hugely informative of how you conduct yourself in your relationships, hugely informative of how you pursue your goals and objectives. And in that regard, I think it's enormously empowering and feeds directly into your sense of agency, rather than being unthinking, non-reflective, or unreflective, I should say, and maybe giving yourself over in that fatalistic way of just going, well, life just happens to me and I've no control. And embracing a sort of a philosophy of reception, a philosophy of passivity. Life happens to me. I don't happen to life. Now, I don't know. I mean, maybe the truth is the truth for me is it's somewhere in between. Of course, life is always going to happen to all of us. That's the nature of existence. That's the nature of what we're born into. That's the nature of all the things we have no control over. There's no predetermination that we have control over, which is to say, there's a huge amount of predetermination and we can't do anything about it. And then we arrive and we grow and we engage. And then it's like, okay, well, how do I respond to this? You know, the reactive choice or the responsive choice. Am I just getting pushed around, or am I going to try and choose responses? And again, you can take that into the self-defense model, into the martial arts model of, you know, all martial arts are fundamentally trying to train you to have response capability rather than just being reactive and allowing other people to other people and the events of life and the circumstances of life to dictate the tempo and to dictate the space you're allowed to occupy, to dictate your sense of safety and wellness. The credo of most martial arts is built around, we're going to give you responses. We're going to give you a whole range of potential responses that are going to keep you safe, that are going to keep you well, that are going to allow you to walk a path with an increased sense of capability and an increased sense of personal integral alignment that is built around self-knowledge and self-understanding. And that is the a central tenet of most martial arts systems that have a philosophy attached to them, is there is no greater enemy than oneself. So know thyself first, and then know others. And that is, that again is central to any of the kind of ideas that I build around wellness, around happiness, around contentment. It's very much about sorting myself out first and understanding myself. Now, how does that then, and we're getting to the end of things, how does that then tie in with defiance? So here is a lovely word. Here's a lovely word to drop into your day-to-day conversation. It's a word that I came across this week, thanks to wordsmith.org. This email, a daily email I get Monday to Friday with a word a day. I've referred to it before. I get the etymology, I get a couple of usage examples, and then there's often an unrelated quote thrown in to conclude the email. Anyway, the other day, this word dropped in my lap. I'd never seen it before, and this word is cacoethes. Cacoethes. Do you like that one? Yeah, I've just been thinking about cacoethes. I do love the cacoethes that live in the bottom of my cupboard. Okay, so what does cacoethes mean? For those of you who are more well schooled than I am, you'll go, well, of course, Dara. Cacoethes means an irresistible urge to do something, especially something inadvisable. So that is what that word means. And apparently the legendary satirist from ancient Rome, Juvenal, and I think that's a hard J as opposed to Juvenal. Juvenal once wrote about, and this is Latin, insanabile scribendi cacoethes, and that translates as the incurable passion for writing. So scribendi, I presume, is writing, and incurable, insanabile, I think it's a root word for sanity maybe there, and then cacoethes is obviously translated as passion. But as I said, the definition, and this is all on my little email that comes into me, an irresistible urge to do something, especially something inadvisable. Now, I'm not going to focus so much on the irresistible urge to do something, although you can interpret that as you wish or decide to what degree that applies to you. But I like the inadvisable part because we are conditioned. We are all conditioned. Unless you've grown up in exceptional circumstances, we are all conditioned to conform. Now, I was raised by hippies, okay? But you say hippies and people they jump to these wild conclusions about what a hippie looks like. There's certainly an aspect of my parents looking like hippies back in the day, but they were, to my mind, there was a conservative underpinning to their hippiness. So they were still very much, go out there, get an education, get a job, work for a living. So nothing radical along those lines. The hippiness manifested itself more, and I have spoken about this before, the hippiness manifested itself more in lifestyle choices, in certain aesthetics, in the nature of the conversations that happened in that house, in the friendship group, and in certain recreational activities, particularly in the area of drug taking and certain hedonistic impulses. But there was still fundamentally a conformity of this is how to live in the mix. And I'm not arguing for a second that my parents represent the full complexity of a hippie outlook that would have emerged in the 60s and 70s. But I can speak for that, my particular experience in that particular family. So even if you're a hippie, you've still inherited the laid out plan. You've still inherited the conformist, conventional model for how to live. And fundamentally, it is considered inadvisable not to go down that road. And certainly that's the message I would have received from my parents, tacitly, if not overtly. And the whole idea then of making a different choice, and making that different choice consciously, willfully, knowingly, that, in my opinion, is one of the greatest acts of defiance you can do. And a huge amount of what I've advocated over the years in school classrooms in particular is pinned to that notion. Think for yourself. Build your own world. Own your own identity without apology or concession to anyone. And again, within reason. I mean, you have to. We take that. I take that model as understanding. We just eliminate maybe extreme circumstances like extreme mental unwellness or extreme deprivation or extreme violence. Let's take the extremities away. Let's just go to the mean, the average, and go, here we are. If you've got, within reason, the same sort of, roughly speaking, the same sort of, social conditioners around, learn how to think for yourself. Learn how to make your own choice. Learn how to just step outside the throng. Step outside that great kind of flow of consensus and just go, hold on, do I actually agree with this? Or am I just being carried along by the current? Carried along by the current of acceptance. Carried along by the current of, sure, why not? Carried along by the current of, there's nothing else available anyway. What's to say? What's to say you can't build your own world around your own personal ideology and value system? Well, there's a lot of stuff to say you can't. And a lot of that revolves around you've got to make a living and you've got to pay your own way and you've got to satisfy the social needs of survival, within a sort of handed down and expected code of behavior. And that is an economic model, that's a social model, that's a cultural model, that's a political model, that's a historical model. And to defy all of that takes tremendous self-possession. But to me, that way lies, I don't know what. That way lies greater agency. That way lies greater opportunity for learning. That way lies greater opportunity for appreciating other people. That way lies greater opportunity for thoughtfulness and reflection, and really a greater understanding of the choices. A greater understanding of the choices available to you, a greater understanding of why you may or may not want to make a particular choice at a particular time. And I think there's power in that. And so it also might make you understand. I don't know, maybe you know, and if that is the path you go down, that inadvisable path of trying to work things out for yourself, maybe then the irresistible urge to, you know, to poke the beast of conformity, to poke that fire. You know, maybe you'll understand the value of that in a way that's not simply a contrarian impulse, or an impulse to gain notoriety, or an impulse to be the rebel. There might be something else. There might be something else informing that impulse. And maybe, I don't know, it's not for me. It's not for me to say what that is. I mean, but on that, I will say, as an actor in the past, not so much in the present, that irresistible urge to do something, I think that's a mind game many actors are capable of playing in their bid to understand what humans are capable of, in a bid to explore an emotional landscape or a psychological landscape that isn't part of their everyday experience. And I think it's why many actors find it easy to go to very sort of dark places, you know, in a character, in a performance, because an actor's brain is wired that way to go, what would it be like if I did this? What would it be like if I did that? Now, in that regard, I really recognize that irresistible urge to do something as a mind game, as a little game of the imagination, because it's not really my impulse in terms of my character as a person, which is, you know, which cleaves much more to patterns of control and patterns of discipline. And just, that's something I might come back to in another episode. I did want to talk today about discipline and setting terms, but I think if I start now, it'll just drag this episode on for longer than you could bear to listen. But I will say then, in conclusion, that defiance, the first part of defiance, is not just accepting what everyone else is doing, not just accepting what everyone else is saying, not just accepting what everyone else is thinking, wearing, eating, showing, not just accepting everyone else's curated bit of hygge, but going, I'll just do my own thing. And that is an act of defiance. And from that act of defiance, you can then maybe build, as a way to gird the loins of your defiance, you may build a regime of discipline that will inform your convictions, that will be the living out of your convictions, and the example that your act of defiance is not madness, that your act of defiance is rooted in your own world building, rooted in self-care, rooted in wellness, and that you are the person who is going to set the terms, rather than Apple, rather than Google, rather than Spotify, rather than this consumerist world we live in, where you're clicking I agree or I accept every time you look online, where terms are constantly being laid before you. I think be your own corporation. Be your own, monstrous entity, and set your own terms, and maybe employ yourself and nobody else. How about that for a metaphor? Does that work? Will you go with that one? Yeah. Okay. So look, maybe next week I'll pick this up again. Maybe next week I'll focus on what discipline looks like to me, and how that serves my own emotional and psychological stability, healthy habits. That's what it comes back to, doesn't it? Okay, maybe I'll tap into that next week. But for now, I will say farewell. Farewell, defiant listeners. You can support me by saying nice things on social media, the platforms we have been given. You can support me by saying nice things. You can support me by recommending the podcast to a friend. And I would appreciate anything like that. You can support me just by shooting me a text or shooting me a message. You can email me at theclearoutlive@gmail.com with feedback, with suggestions for future topics. I do hope in the coming weeks to start having an occasional interview on the podcast and to talk to people about their own journey, their own wellness regimes and routines, their own wellness strategies, what they're doing in their lives, and the relationship between what they're doing and how that feeds into their sense of being okay in the world. So yeah, hopefully I'm going to make that happen in the next few weeks. So that might be something to look forward to. You can support me using the supporter link, which you'll find in the description wherever you're listening to this podcast. The supporter link will allow you to give a one-time donation to the podcast. It could be the response to a particular episode. It could be your response to where this podcast serves you in any way, shape or form. You can also support me using the Patreon link, which you'll also find in the description wherever you're listening to this podcast. And a Patreon contribution is a regular monthly contribution that contributes to the sustainability of this independent podcast, which is produced by little old me here in #blessed. So otherwise, you'll find me out there on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever. I should be out there. The Clear Out Podcast. I'm Dara Clear. Thank you for listening. You look after yourself. Take care. Stay safe. Stay well. Stay positive. Okay. All the best. Mind yourself. Defy.